You think gold is expensive at almost $2,000 an ounce? That could turn out to be the bargain of a lifetime if the world returns to some form of gold standard. That's according to John Butler, author of The Golden Revolution, and he joins me now. John, you say a return to the gold standard, or a metal standard, is inevitable. Why?
Inevitable is a strong word, but if you start to connect the dots and you look at the situation today, in fact, it leads you back to a gold standard. In brief, the U.S. economy has declined very dramatically as a share of the global economy since the Bretton Woods agreements broke down in the early 1970s. That's number one. Number two, what you find is that U.S. monetary policy is increasingly at odds with what other countries want. And indeed, at the recent BRIC summit in New Delhi, they issued this Delhi Declaration, which specifically criticized the Fed and U.S. economic policy generally as destabilizing their economies. So you're getting a real breakdown now. Finally, if you actually look at what restores credibility and stability to a clearly destabilized global financial system, it is gold. It's the simplest way to do it. Wait a little while, someone will be a first mover, and then they will force the issue.
Talk us through the time frame for this, because you say this could happen remarkably as early as next year.
I think it could happen as early as next year, and one reason why is because when the BRIC nations made this declaration recently, they also said very specifically that they are now working on forming their own international monetary fund, their own World Bank, and indeed will continue to grow their dependence on bilateral currency arrangements for trade. And they claim that they will complete a lot of this work inside of 1 year. It is conceivable that inside of 1 year, if the BRIC countries are still strongly dissatisfied with the dollar reserve standard that still prevails in the world, they will start to move formally back to gold.
Talk us through step by step how that is going to happen.
There are more than one way in which this could happen. One of them is that one country becomes a clear first mover and completely surprises the entire world, including the United States, by pegging its currency to gold explicitly. Russia is not an unreasonable country that might, under certain circumstances, decide to do precisely that. So imagine, if you will, at some point, say August 2013, Russia announces to the world that it will henceforth back the currency, which they could rename if they wanted to, by gold explicitly. What happens? Well, think about it. Investors around the world, concerned about U.S. finances, concerned about U.S. economic policy, think maybe we should diversify our dollars. Maybe we should cash out some of our dollar reserves and hold these new gold-backed Russian reserves instead. Well, if that process starts in earnest, and if some countries start to diversify out of dollars, other countries will have to take up the slack. What if they don't take up the slack? The dollar will decline, potentially precipitously. You can imagine a situation in which you have another crisis meeting, say at Camp David, just as occurred to determine how to deal with the breakdown of Bretton Woods. President Nixon decided to close the gold window. What would be decided this time around? It's quite possible that if the United States sees the rest of the world moving in this direction, that the United States will simply decide it must follow along. It has no other choice other than for the dollar to lose reserve status entirely.
If that's the case, why isn't gold at $10,000 an ounce?
It's really only going to reach that sort of magnitude if indeed it becomes clear and present that the world is going to be using gold not just as an alternative store of value, but as a de facto monetary asset in actual cross-border balance of payments transactions. So I do think we're on the way to something north of 5,000, possibly north of 10,000, depending on this actual structure of this future gold standard.
The gold market is tiny compared to the trillions and trillions of dollars worth of cash and assets sloshing around the world financial system. How can countries back all of that against such a finite and tiny amount of gold?
The amount of gold is finite by weight or volume. It's not finite by price. And as we just discussed, if gold is going to be remonetized, it's entirely reasonable that its price will rise by an order of magnitude. And in fact, if the price of gold were to rise to over $10,000 an ounce, then in fact what you would have is a market capitalization, as it were, of gold vis-a-vis the money supply and credit volume generally, which is in line with a longer-term historical comparison. It implies stability.
John, Thank you very much. That was John Butler, author of The Golden Revolution, talking to Reuters TV, appropriately enough, in the Goldsmith Hall in the City of London. I'm Jamie McGeever. This is Reuters.